Scotland's deadliest serial killers that you've probably never even heard of. Strangely, there is now a strip club named after them. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the Burke and Hare murders. In the early 1800s, beautiful Edinburgh, Scotland was the place to go if you wanted to study medicine, anatomy. It was actually the best place in Europe for it. In order to teach certain parts of anatomy, professors needed to use cadavers. A cadaver is a dead body which is used for the purposes of education, science, or medical practice. And these were actually quite difficult to get a hold of. Legally, only the body of prisoners, people who had taken their own lives, and orphans could be used for these practices. This meant that there was actually a shortage of cadavers, and professors were absolutely crying out for them. During this time in Edinburgh, grave robbing was rife. People would literally dig up graves to steal the bodies and sell them to the professors. It got so bad that some families would enlist the help of guards to stand over their loved ones' graves, others would cover the graves with an iron gate, and others would literally just put a big slab of concrete on top of the grave only until the body was so decomposed that it wasn't sellable. William Burke and William Hare were two men originally from Ireland who immigrated to Scotland. They met in the Westport area of Edinburgh, which is now Edinburgh's Old Town, and they struck up an immediate friendship. I imagine their shared Irishness bonding them together. Hare was the owner of a boarding house which he ran alongside his wife. However, come 1827, it became a murder house. In November of 1827, a man who was nicknamed Old Donald was a guest at the boarding house when he suddenly fell incredibly ill and then died of natural causes. Hare was frustrated that Old Donald had died because he still actually owed some money for his lodgings, which was about the equivalent of £270 a day. And somehow, he got the idea that he was going to sell Old Donald's body in order to recover that money back. He and Burke stole Old Donald's body from inside of his coffin and hid it under a bed inside of the boarding house, and then refilled the coffin with loads of wood so it was still heavy, so no one would suspect that the body had been moved. Old Donald was taken to Edinburgh University, where Professor Robert Knox bought him for £7. This is when Burke and Hare realised that they could make a killing off killing, and in the span of just 10 months, they would become Scotland's deadliest serial killers. In January 1828, Burke and Hare would commit their first murder. A mill worker named James was staying at the boarding house when he started to come over feeling really unwell, and instead of trying to help him or going to get him a doctor, the men made him guzzle down whiskey until he was incapacitated, unable to defend himself, and then he was smothered. Hare would cover James's face with a pillow while Burke was leaning or pressing down on his chest so that he was unable to breathe. This would kill James, and it would become their MO. They would purposefully pick people who they thought that no one would miss. So this is vulnerable people, disabled people, sex workers, people who were travelling alone. They would be lured into the boarding house, incapacitated with whiskey, and then smothered before being sold to Professor Robert Knox for £10 a pop. They would murder at least 16 people this way and sold their bodies to Robert, who on at least one occasion made a comment about how lovely and fresh the bodies were. Apparently wasn't at all concerned or even curious as to where the bodies were coming from, because he was getting multiple per month from these men. Because they had been getting away with it for so long and no one was suspecting a thing, it was going to Burke and Hare's head. They thought that they were invincible, and so they started being more brazened. 18-year-old James Wilson was a vulnerable, disabled, homeless young man who was often seen begging on the streets. He was lured to the boarding house, likely with the promise of a roof over his head for the night. James didn't like whiskey, and so when it was offered to him, he politely declined. He preferred something called snuff, and so Burke and Hare gave him that, only the snuff wouldn't incapacitate him as much as the whiskey would, and so when they began to try and smother James, he was alert enough that he was able to try and fight back, but with 2 against 1, it was no match. match, and he too would be murdered. James's body was sold to Robert, and this would be the first time that the cadaver that they were working on was recognised by some of the staff and or the students. James actually had a very identifying feature, and that was that he had club feet, his feet turned inwards, and so he was very recognisable. When it was brought up to him that some of the people recognised this cadaver, Robert completely denied it, said there was no way that they would recognise this person, and in order to try and conceal his identity, Robert would decapitate and then amputate the feet from this body. The final known victim of Burke and Hare was a woman named Margaret. She was an Irish woman, and probably when she heard the familiar Irish accents, she felt immediately comfortable with Burke and Hare. They even pretended that they were from the same part of Ireland as she was in order to lure her to the boarding house. Only on this occasion, they didn't have a spare room. Burke and Hare managed to convince a couple named Anne and James to go to another boarding house for the night. They said that Margaret was a close family friend who was just popping by and was in desperate need of a room. So the couple agreed. They left the bedsit, and they did briefly return later that night, where they saw both of the men and Margaret, who seemed to be in good spirits. They were drunk, they were laughing, and they were dancing about. When they arrived the following day though, that is when the alarm bells began to ring, because Burke and Hare would not let Anne and James back into their room where all of their things still were. Hours later, when the building was finally empty, the couple broke inside of their room, and that is where they discovered the body of Margaret, who was allegedly hid under the bed in a pool of her own blood. Anne and James raced to the police to report what they had seen. However, by the time that they arrived, Margaret's body was already gone, just a pool of blood left behind. Burke and Hare had already taken her body and sold her to Robert, however the police quickly caught up with them. Because the bodies had already been dissected and some of them were already gone away from the university, this was going to be a hard case to prove, specifically because of the way that they were murdered, smothering. That doesn't leave as much obvious damage as a stabbing, for example. After being arrested, both of the men immediately turned on each other. They apparently had no loyalty to one another. It was Hare who was actually offered immunity in exchange for a complete confession and testifying against Burke, which he absolutely jumped for. William Burke would go on to be found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed on the 28th of January 1829 at Lawmarket, where thousands of people came to watch. Ironically, his body was donated to medical science, and his skeleton is actually still on display inside of a museum to this day. William Hare walked away from this as a free man, despite helping to murder 16 people, and we have no idea what happened to him after this. Something I discovered when researching, which actually gave us the shock of my life when I seen it, was that there is now a strip club in Edinburgh named after the serial killers. It is named Burke and Hare, and apparently it's one of the best strip clubs in Edinburgh. Comment down below and let me know, had you heard of these serial killers before?